Cinema often judges war through comfort. Critics look for symbolism, restraint, irony. Veterans look for truth, and those two perspectives almost never agree. Some war films are dismissed as too loud, too simple, too patriotic, or too brutal. But among the people who actually carried rifles, felt the weight of body armor, and lived with the silence afterward, those same films hit differently because they're not about being clever. They're about being recognizable. These are films critics often rejected, but veterans embraced, defended, and quietly passed to each other like shared memories. Not because they're perfect, but because they feel honest. We Were Soldiers, 2002. When We Were Soldiers was released, critics accused it of being old-fashioned, too respectful, too earnest, too unwilling to criticize the war itself. But that criticism completely missed the point. This film was never trying to explain Vietnam. It was trying to show what it felt like to stand in the middle of chaos with responsibility on your shoulders. Based on the Battle of Ia Drang, the first major engagement between U.S. forces and the North Vietnamese army, the film focuses on preparation as much as combat, training, family goodbyes, the weight of command. Mel Gibson's Colonel Hal Moore isn't portrayed as a mythic hero. He's a man constantly calculating loss before it happens, counting lives, making decisions that will haunt him no matter what he chooses. Veterans responded to the details critics ignored, the radio chatter, the confusion of overlapping commands, the way leadership isolates you emotionally. Battlefield scenes are loud and violent, yes, but not glamorous. The film understands something crucial. Bravery is rarely cinematic. It's repetitive, exhausting, terrifying. And the most respected element among veterans? The film never forgets the families waiting at home. It treats their anxiety as part of the war itself. Critics saw sentimentality. Veterans saw recognition. Act of Valor, 2012. Few modern war films were attacked as harshly as Act of Valor. Critics mocked its wooden performances. They complained about its lack of nuance. They dismissed it as propaganda. But Act of Valor was never pretending to be a traditional drama. The lead performers weren't actors. They were active-duty Navy SEALs. And that choice changed everything. Veterans connected immediately to the authenticity of movement, weapon handling, communication, spacing, tactics, things actors almost always get wrong. The film's dialogue is minimal because the real operations aren't filled with speeches. They're filled with the silence, signals, and short commands. And what critics called emotionless, veterans recognized as operational mindset. You don't crack jokes mid-mission. You don't deliver monologues. You focus, because focus keeps you alive. The combat sequences aren't staged for spectacle. They're procedural, almost clinical. And that's exactly why veterans respected it. Act of Valor doesn't ask you to admire the soldiers. It asks you to observe how the job is done and what it costs. It's not about politics. It's about precision, sacrifice, and the quiet professionalism that never makes headlines. 12 Strong, 2018. 12 Strong arrived quietly and left quietly, largely dismissed as generic modern war entertainment. Critics called it shallow, predictable, too heroic. But veterans saw something else entirely. This was the story of the first U.S. Special Forces team deployed to Afghanistan after 9/11. No blueprint, no supply lines, no modern infrastructure. Just 12 men riding horses into hostile territory, relying on trust, improvisation, and relationships with unfamiliar allies. Veterans respected how the film showed uncertainty. These soldiers weren't portrayed as invincible. They were outnumbered, undersupplied, and constantly adapting. The film captures something rarely emphasized. Modern warfare isn't always about firepower. It's about cooperation, learning local customs, building fragile alliances, operating without clear rules or guarantees. The emotional restraint also resonated. There's no exaggerated grief, no melodrama. Loss happens quickly, then the mission continues because it has to. Critics wanted deeper commentary. Veterans recognize the reality. Sometimes history moves faster than reflection. The Green Berets, in 1968. No war film has been criticized more relentlessly or defended more fiercely offshore than The Green Berets. Released during the height of anti-Vietnam War sentiment, it was dismissed as outdated propaganda almost immediately. John Wayne's presence alone made critics recoil, but for veterans of that era, the film meant something else. It's one of the few mainstream movies that didn't portray soldiers as villains or fools. It treated service with seriousness and respect at a time when many veterans were returning home to hostility. The film doesn't question policy, it doesn't dissect ideology, it focuses on camaraderie, training, and duty. Veterans understood that not every war film is meant to be an argument. Some are meant to be a reassurance that their service wasn't meaningless. For soldiers who felt abandoned by public opinion, the Green Berets offered dignity. Critics saw simplicity. Veterans saw solidarity. Lone Survivor, 2013. Lone Survivor split audiences immediately. Critics accused it of glorifying violence and reducing war to spectacle. Some felt it was emotionally manipulative. Veterans had a very different reaction. Based on the failed Operation Red Wings, the film doesn't soften its brutality. It shows confusion, mistakes, pain. The extended firefight sequences are exhausting, intentionally so. They replicate the physical toll of combat rather than presenting it as thrilling. Veterans recognize the chaos, the disorientation, the way plans collapse within seconds. What resonated most deeply was the emphasis on brotherhood, the refusal to abandon a teammate, even when logic says you should. The film doesn't celebrate victory, it mourns loss, and for many veterans, that honesty mattered more than critical approval. Jarhead 2005. When Jarhead was released, critics didn't know what to do with it. It wasn't a traditional war film. There were no triumphant battles, no clear moral arc. Some audiences even felt cheated. Veterans didn't. Jarhead captured something rarely acknowledged: the boredom, frustration, and psychological tension of modern warfare. Waiting, training, anticipation without release. The film understands that combat doesn't define military life. Anticipation does. Veterans related to the emotional dissonance. Being trained to fight, then never being allowed to. The film also explores alienation from civilians, from relationships, from normality itself. Critics wanted action. Veterans recognized the truth. War often happens in the mind long before it happens on the battlefield. Black Hawk Down, 2001. When Black Hawk Down was released, critics were divided. Some accused it of being propaganda. Others said it lacked context, character depth, or moral framing. Veterans saw something very different. Ridley Scott didn't make a traditional war movie. He made a combat experience. There is no clear beginning or ending. No speeches explaining why the mission matters. No tidy emotional arcs. Just confusion, noise, orders shouted over gunfire, and young men trying desperately not to let each other die. The Battle of Mogadishu unfolds in real time. Helicopters downed, radios failing, plans collapsing. And that's exactly why veterans connected to it. Combat doesn't pause for reflection, doesn't wait for clarity. It's chaotic, terrifying, and exhausting. Former Rangers and Delta operators have repeatedly praised the film for its accuracy. From radio chatter to movement tactics to the sheer sensory overload. The criticism that it was emotionally distant is exactly what many soldiers recognized as truth. Because in combat, emotion is suppressed. It's not explored. Black Hawk Down doesn't ask you how to feel. It shows you what it's like when everything goes wrong. And survival becomes the only objective. The Siege of Firebase Gloria, 1989. This is one of the most overlooked Vietnam films ever made, and one of the most respected among veterans. The Siege of Firebase Gloria doesn't have flashy cinematography or grand political statements. It's gritty, low budget, claustrophobic, and that's why it works. Set during the Tet Offense, focuses on a small group of Marines defending a remote firebase against relentless attacks. There's no hero fantasy here, no victory montage, just exhaustion, fear, and the slow erosion of morale. Veterans have praised how the film captures boredom, tension, and sudden violence, the emotional rhythm of Vietnam combat. R. Lee Ermey's performance is especially respected, not because it's loud, but because it feels authentic. Critics dismiss the film as simplistic or dated. Veterans recognize something rare, a war film that understands that holding ground can be just as brutal as advancing, and that sometimes survival itself is the mission. Hamburger Hill, 1987. Critics often compared Hamburger Hill unfavorably to Platoon and Full Metal Jacket. They wanted commentary, they wanted symbolism, veterans wanted recognition. The film tells the story of the Battle of Hill 937, a brutal, seemingly pointless fight that cost dozens of lives and was later abandoned. And that's exactly why it mattered. Hamburger Hill doesn't justify the battle. It doesn't explain it away. It doesn't turn it into a lesson. It just shows young men being sent uphill, again and again, under impossible conditions. Veterans have said the film captures the frustration of Vietnam better than most classics. The feeling that sacrifice was demanded without explanation, that orders came without context, that survival depended on the man next to you, not ideology. The lack of a triumphant ending angered critics, but for those who lived it, that emptiness felt honest. Because not every battle makes sense, and not every sacrifice is acknowledged. 13 Hours, The Secret Soldiers of Benghazi, 2016. Michael Bay was the wrong name to attach to this film, at least in critics' eyes. They expected explosions without restraint. Instead, they got a surprisingly restrained portrayal of a real modern battle. 13 Hours focuses on the CIA security contractors who defended the U.S. compound in Benghazi during the 2012 attack. Critics accused it of political bias. Veterans focused on something else entirely: tactics, communication failures, defensive positioning, and the unbearable tension of waiting for support that never comes. Former operators praised the film for showing how private security teams actually function. Not as lone wolves, but as disciplined professionals working under extreme pressure. The film avoids turning its characters into superheroes. They get tired, they make mistakes, they argue. And when the fighting starts, it's not glamorous, it's desperate. Veterans often describe 13 Hours as frustrating to watch, not because it's inaccurate, but because it captures the helplessness of being abandoned in a fight. That frustration is the point. Saints and Soldiers, 2003, quiet, low budget, almost invisible on release. Saints and Soldiers doesn't look like a war epic, and that's why it endures. Inspired by the Malmedy massacre during World War II, the film follows a small group of Allied soldiers trapped behind enemy lines. There are no sweeping battles, no massive explosions, just men trying to survive winter, hunger, fear, and doubt. Veterans often praise the film's portrayal of moral conflict, the constant weighing of duty against survival. Unlike many World War II films, it doesn't present soldiers as symbols. They're just people. Scared, faithful, angry, hope. Critics dismissed it as slow and modest, but veterans appreciated its focus on small decisions. The kind that don't make headlines but define survival. Because war isn't always about winning battles. Sometimes it's about getting home with your humanity intact. Rules of Engagement, 2000. Perhaps no film on this list divided critics and veterans more sharply. Rules of Engagement was accused of oversimplifying modern warfare and portraying civilians irresponsibly. Veterans saw something else. They saw a film willing to confront the impossible decisions soldiers are sometimes forced to make in seconds with incomplete information under lethal threat. The film centers on a Marine officer faced court-martial after ordering his men to fire during a chaotic embassy evacuation. Veterans have often defended the film for acknowledging something uncomfortable, that rules of engagement are written in peace, but enforced in chaos. The courtroom drama framing frustrated critics, but for service members it reflected a real fear. Those making life or death decisions on the ground are later judged by people who were never there. The film doesn't argue that war is clean. It argues that judgment is easy, and responsibility is heavy. That message resonated deeply with those who've carried it. War films aren't history books, they're memories. And memories don't always fit critical theory or cinematic trends. The films on this list weren't embraced by reviewers or awards committees. They didn't always say the right things. They didn't always make audiences comfortable, but they spoke to the people who mattered most. Because veterans don't look for perfection on screen. They look for recognition. They look for the fear that doesn't go away. The silence after gunfire. The loyalty that forms between people who may never speak again, but would die for each other without hesitation. These films survive because truth has a longer lifespan than approval, and long after critics move on to the next trend, these stories remain, passed quietly between those who know. If you want more films like these, stories that respect the weight of service rather than exploit it, you know where to find us. This is Frame Time, and where misunderstood war films are finally understood.